Hello and welcome to the Pharma Forum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. A few weeks ago on the podcast, after I attended Reuters Pharma USA, Eloise McLennan, our deep dive editor, came on to interview me about the show. Today we're flipping it around. I'm going to interview Eloise, as well as our web editor, Nicole Raleigh, about what they saw and heard at Reuters Pharma Europe. These events are an excellent opportunity to get a snapshot of what the industry is talking about. And it was a packed 3-day event, so I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit about what we heard there. If we have a little extra time, Nicole's been very busy traveling to some other events too, so we might hear just a little bit from those as well. Welcome to the show, Eloise and Nicole.
Hello. It's nice to be on this side of the interview for a change.
I find that side's a lot more work, actually. So, first of all, let's kind of start with overall impressions from the event. What were kind of the major themes that you heard over and over again? What were the themes that it felt like the event organizers were trying to emphasize? If you had to walk away with a couple of top line thoughts, what would they be? Let's start with Nicole.
Thanks, Jonah. I was used to letting Eloise go first, so I'll plunge in. I think, and I'm sure Eloise will agree with me, given conversations we had on the floor at Reuters Pharma Barcelona, there was very much this, let's call it centralizing of patient centricity across the landscape of life sciences this year. And of course, facilitating that is this move towards precision, personalization, and then DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Basically, it's no longer just talking the talk, but walking the walk. It is finding a way to put everything in place and have that last crucial, the reason for it all, access for patients to everything that's being developed.
So patient centricity, patient access. Eloise, what would you add?
So I was in some very different tracks to Nicole this time, and my takeaways are, I think, a bit different. So beginning the whole event, we talked a little bit about we didn't know what kind of big cat it was, but Reuters Pharma US had a big cat as its imagery throughout the time. For Reuters Pharma Europe, we had rowing boats and ideas of teamwork needed to pull the rowboat to its finish line. And that was a real sticking point throughout a lot of the presentations, was this idea of you cannot do this alone. And the second point, one that I found very, very interesting, is that we've been talking about AI for a really, really long time. I'd never seen AI talked about in relation to art history quite as much as I saw throughout Reuters Europe. And it's the idea of pioneers in art who were seen as not great during their time, but after that point are now revered as some of the greatest artists in the world. And the idea of adoption being a similar trend to observing art history, that you are either an early adopter and you see the value early on, obviously, or you are one of the laggards who comes to it a little bit late.
At the U.S. event, there was a lot of focus on U.S.-specific policy, either specific laws like the IRA or U.S. sort of dramas and considerations like our drug pricing more broadly. Were there any sort of uniquely European trends or issues you heard about, whether the specific in terms of regulation or reimbursement, or more general in terms of sort of like European ethos, or what people are thinking about over there?
Yeah, I can take that opening one. You're right, Nicole. I do talk first quite a lot. One of the key things is the updates to EU legislation and regulation that we've got coming up. I think it's next year, early next year. And the response to that, which actually links into my idea of art history, because I remember, is it Kathleen Schaefer, who's head of market access at Beijing, was talking about the adoption and the anticipation of this update to regulation. And she referred to it as the scream. She said this was the reaction when I typed into AI, what was the reaction to the first introduction of pharma regulation? And she said it was the scream. That's what it came up with, of that not really knowing what to expect, what's going on, where everything will land, and that confusion that surrounds very, very, not even the big changes, but small changes as well within the pharma industry, where we're very much set on, we need to know the outcomes in order to be okay with change. When you don't know the outcomes, everything becomes much more of an unsafe situation for decision makers. So it was really interesting to see how that was being tackled on stage, and as well as in the discussions off stage of, are we actually prepared for this? What is actually going to be the changes? And then how will the reaction be from the pharma industry and from regulators?
Yeah, let's stay with AI for a minute. Nicole, what did you hear around AI?
Around AI. Sorry, I wanted to respond firstly to what Eloise was saying about these sort of proposals coming forth. Obviously, or perhaps not obviously for listeners, before attending Reuters Pharma Barcelona, I was at the Economist Impact Summit on Cell and Gene Therapies in Brussels. And of course, there was sort of wide discussion of the European Commission's proposal for revised general pharmaceutical legislation. And really the focus there was on better incentives, transparency, funding, supply chain security. And of this notion of security, it comes back to what Eloise was saying about risk. How can you really put forth frameworks or sort of quantify the risk and have policy in place when you're talking about, with ATMPs, one-time cures and perhaps 15-year follow-up? So it's very much trying to structure for what is pretty much an unknown. If we come back off the sort of unknown to AI, Jonah, as you wanted to, AI was, of course, as Eloise was alluding to, also a central theme at Reuters. But I think, what was it called, Eloise? No longer hype, time to grieve or something for AI, something like that.
Ooh.
It was very much about the dying hype.
It was. Can I take a point on that?
So take a point.
The AI, It's Time to Grieve was an absolutely fantastic presentation that built upon one that we saw last year, which was the idea that AI is a dance and you have to come and join in. But I think to set that up on day one of the opening keynote speeches came from Aaron Bjork from Microsoft. And his presentation was probably the one that has stuck with me since we left, probably the most. And it was talking again about adoption rates. And I think one of the reasons his presentation made the greatest impact on me in relation to AI was he said two small words even. We failed. And he's talking about Microsoft had such great success with the home computer. But then when the phone came about, Microsoft lagged behind to the point where we all know that Apple dominated that market and continues to do so. And then with cloud computing, again, Microsoft did not capitalize on what became a huge market. And so now he was talking about the idea that he needs to get into that market early, that Microsoft is making a real push to be at the forefront of this. And you see this with Copilot. Copilot's been a huge driver in working with industries that may not necessarily have adopted AI in the past, and trying to convince people that they should be pioneers in this space. It's the idea that AI it's the grieving period of AI, which was spoken about in relation to there is no going back. The Pandora's box of AI has been opened. You cannot put a lid back on it. And so you have to come to terms with the fact that it is here, that it is going to impact your job. It's going to be the way that you relate to it, the way that you interact with it, the way that you adopt it to make your processes better. That is going to determine how you thrive in a realm of AI. It's not going to be whether or not you can compete with AI, because you can't, because the companies that will be employing AI will just be ahead of you. Whether that be in terms of manpower, in terms of computing power. We know that AI can sift through files thousands of times quicker than a human ever could. So it's that, what do you do on the next stage? are you going to be one of those early adopters, or are you going to be left behind? Which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah. I think in that you've covered a lot there about what was discussed with AI, but Liu Zhang from Takeda also mentioned in a panel at Reuters discussing Gen AI. She left actually the audience on a very poignant note perhaps, and said, don't worry if you haven't yet gone to AI, it will come to you. And she was talking very much from a company perspective where AI is pervasive throughout that company. And then also on the panel with her was AstraZeneca's Nagarajan, who noted that there has been facilitated through the employment of AI this shift slightly from data siloing through the use of cloud-based computing. So when you mentioned Pandora's box, yes, demonic entities, problems, whatever. But what was also in the box was hope. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that this hope has replaced the hype, because with hope comes a lot more of an even keel mindset, where people are now, or companies rather now, are starting to really focus on what is needed that AI will help with. It's having that end goal, and this end goal is something that must be shared when it comes to partnerships. As you mentioned earlier, there were the different sort of mascots, as it were, for each of the Reuters conferences this year. The cheetah for USA and the team rowing boat for Europe. And Europe, the conference there was very much centered around partnership, around collaboration, how it cannot be done alone. Whereas perhaps, Jonah, you've got some comments upon the cheetah representing speed or acceleration in the US?
I think it was about speed, evolution, keeping up. It definitely was more of a focus on sort of, well, as you might expect in the US, a little more individualized, although certainly there is a lot of talk about working together, especially around access challenges. Which maybe is where I want to go next. Nicole, you mentioned at the Economist event and also at Reuters, this idea of these one-time cures and figuring out how to manage the pricing, the reimbursement, the access, the equitable access to them, which I know is a huge conversation over here in the US, but I imagine it's a slightly different conversation in Europe, just because payment is so different there. But what did you hear there?
So, as with most of these discussions around the reimbursement models in Europe, it comes to finding a framework, a fit, where there isn't quite this, I suppose the word is siloing when it comes to border distinctions between the member states. So very much the conversations last year and this year yet were about finding a way, a wording, a means by which these treatments can be accessed across borders. Because when you're talking about ATMPs, you're oftentimes mostly talking about rare diseases, or you're talking about cancer and the like. I mean, there are 1 in 12 Europeans who has a rare disease. That's, I think from memory, that's about 40 million people across Europe. So it's not a case of providing a framework for a select few, even though when we talk about clinical trial design for rare diseases, it does seem a select few, and then you've got the issues of comparative arms and stuff like that. Rather, it's a hell of a lot of people, to put it bluntly. So discussion was around that, and it came up that Belgium actually is a centre of excellence for the production. So it could come to this having in place centres of excellence, manufacturing centres. It's having in perhaps each member state the ability, but that's a cost implication on a massive scale. And the Minister of Health from Lithuania was discussing this also. It, in short, is still perhaps, although it seems really pessimistic to say it, it is something that is yet at the discussion stage and not yet at this actioning implementation stage.
Yeah, I think building on that, there was a lot of discussions about the discrepancy in time to market across member states. For example, I believe it was it was either Cyprus or the exact country has slipped my mind, but you can find it on the Pharma Forum live blog that we did throughout the day, where they were talking about how some countries can take 300 days, 600 days for a drug to make it from approval to the patient. Whereas in other countries, it can be 90 days. It can be so much faster than in other countries. And there are a number of reasons for this. One of the ones that I didn't really think about it until we actually went into it is packaging. The differences in packaging and distribution between different states makes a huge difference. And I mean, you can slightly relate it to the US in terms of each state has its own specific rules, but then you have the federal government, which will determine what happens. With the EU, it's really, really complicating a version of that. So you have each individual country will have its own rules for distribution, it will have its own rules for marketing, and you have to jump through all of these hurdles. So it's incredibly difficult to get your drug to market at the same time across every single state. I don't actually think it's been done within the time period that has been set out that we're aiming to reach for. So there's a lot of conversations that need to happen before we can even start to get to that. And I think, as Nicole has mentioned a number of times, the word silos. In order for us to do that, we need to actually start breaking down those silos. And it's one thing to say we're challenging silos and we're making sure that we're actually talking to each other, and another thing to actually see that in action. And I think this is really the first year where we've started to see some actual results of things that have happened since we started talking about it last year. So it'll be interesting, I think, over the next few months and next year to see what progress we see in actually trying to get those times to market down.
We talked a little bit about access and about equitable access in terms of countries, but also, of course, I know there was a focus on DEI, on equity in terms of different, marginalized groups. There was a session I saw on women's health. Talk to me about kind of what you heard around that topic.
So there was one particular presentation that I saw from Vive Healthcare. And if anybody doesn't know, Vive specializes on HIV. That's their big focus. And one of the things that they were presenting was a headset, basically. I think it was with Oculus. And they designed this experience for a clinician, for a HCP, to understand the stigma that is still associated with HIV diagnosis. And they were talking about how patients would come to them and say, oh, it's the little things that are getting to me. Things like the second someone finds out that I am HIV positive, they will give me a much wider space than they would do before they had found that out. And how those little moments build up into something that becomes unmanageable for the patient to deal with, on top of the physical symptoms that you can experience through treatment, through the condition itself. But having that experience for an HCP is the idea of putting yourself into somebody else's shoes. It's incredibly difficult to understand unless you are actually experiencing that. So they went away and they filmed different scenarios that would illustrate what people can go through on a daily basis to help understand that side of treatment that might not necessarily have been taken into the wider picture when you're actually approaching to treatment. Because maybe your patient would need somebody to speak to. Maybe there are external factors that are going to impact, say, adherence. If you want your patient to continue taking their treatment, but they start to view their treatment in a real negative light, then that's going to impact the outcomes that you get. So I thought that was a really important element that I hadn't seen so much at any other conferences, in terms of that inclusivity is actually taking steps to put yourself in the eyes of the patient and to understand the wider experience. Nicole, you were going to say about the women's health panel.
I can only say that I hope the men of the species put themselves in women's shoes, as it were. We're not just a rib plucked out, according to some. There are 70% of women, for example, who are affected by fibroids. Apparently, this is a niche market. This is what Ramana Oxborough, who's the VP of Healthcare Business Women's Association, was saying in the final presentation of Reuters Pharma Europe. My first question, even though she was clearly enthused that this conversation could be had, this presentation could be given, my immediate question was, why was it the final presentation? Why was women's health not included in the whole run of it? I mean, we're not separate, we're not other. Times have moved on. So basically for me, women's health, we keep saying it, and we had March and International Women's Month and Day on the 8th of March. We keep saying it as if it is something separate, and it really is not. I mean, we're here today in a Pharma Forum podcast recapping on events. We've got two women, one lovely man as our editor-in-chief. That's equality, maybe a little skewed against you today, Jonah. But anyway, the thing is, if we think about, for example, health tech, there was also a panel with Organon's Dr. Ferreira, and he, obviously, Organon, as you know, Eloise, because you've worked with them for the magazine Deep Dive, they specialize in femtech. And it was about this concept of also women not just being small men when it comes to dosing of medications as well. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, as is specific to once upon a time a white male, middle-class white male, and this goes across the spectrum. It comes away from gender, sex, it goes towards socioeconomic demographics, goes towards race, etc. It has to get to a point where you are dealing with the human as a species. It is not distinct into pockets.
I know a lot of that work that needs to be done now is sort of making up for many years of not thinking about this kind of representation in clinical trials, and the way that impacts all the existing literature and the existing, kind of assumptions underlying development. I think that's it. Yeah, that's a really important topic, obviously. So thanks for diving into that, Nicole. Nicole, I noticed that you spent a lot of time day two at Digital Health Track, looking at digital health and digital therapeutics. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what was discussed there and what that landscape is like right now in Europe.
I think it's more about talking about digital health as the landscape is across the board, perhaps. And this comes back to what we've been discussing with issues of access. So digital health technologies certainly in some regards circumvent problems that arise when it comes to, for example, attending a clinical trial site or attending a GP appointment when it takes a long time to travel to such. But what's important when you consider digital health is that it yet maintains a human face-to-face point of contact. That's something that comes across all the time. If we go into the specifics of what's been discussed recently with digital health and health technology, as I say, it's about enhancement, and what it's enhancing is the patient experience and better patient outcomes. It helps with medication adherence. It helps with symptom checking and recording, and can operate as an early intervention tool should something change within the patient's body. It's a preventative measure. We talk a lot when it comes to digital health how it can assist in behavior change, particularly when it comes to weight management or those with obesity. And that, as is clear, that goes hand in hand with medications that you might be taking as well to assist. And then you've got developments, obviously, with digital therapeutics and their assistance with, as it were, doubling up with therapy, being there as, again, a point of contact in those wee small hours when a human therapist might not be.
I think I can add to that slightly. Some of the conversations that I was hearing on the floor were in terms of, as Nicole said, that in between the episodic visits, those face-to-face episodic visits are incredibly important. But for the patient, that adds a lot of burden and stress because you suddenly have to remember everything that has happened to you across like a month maybe. And there might be some elements that you consider as a patient that are a higher priority, but maybe aren't necessarily the priority for the clinician. So say if you were having a real pain in your foot that was stopping you from getting out of bed, but you'd started getting increasing number of headaches, the foot pain that's stopping you from getting out of bed is probably going to be your priority. But if you're getting increasing headaches, that can be a symptom of something that is more serious, needs to be looked at now. And so having those in between places where patients can go input what's happening to them, you get a far more, and we've been talking about this for a while in healthcare, holistic view of the patient, which can really benefit clinicians, because the fact of the matter is that healthcare thrives on data, and you have to ensure that the data that you're collecting is valuable. And so you have a complete picture that you can look at and then make your decisions.
I appreciate you bringing back around to the patient, Eloise, because the very first thing Nicole said when I asked her about general impressions was about the focus on the patient. And so I'd love to, before I ask you guys sort of what we missed, circle way back to that. And Nicole, what were the ways that sort of priority and that trend manifested itself at Reuters, the patient centricity, the focus on the patient?
Good question. I think it's taken a while for pharma perhaps to realise that the patient is centre, and that's been openly acknowledged, which that could be one reason for the greater onus this year. But at the same time, what is also a conversational topic increasingly discussed is value-based care. And when we think about the patient, that care, it has to be valuable, it has to be one of trust. It has to, as Eloise was saying, actually, if the patient doesn't believe that they're going to get better from a certain treatment, then likelihood is psychosomatically they won't. So when we're talking about the patient becoming centric, they're talking about also within the entire clinical trial design process as well, actually asking the patient, what is feasible in attending a trial? What do you need? What's your unmet need as a patient in whatever disease you're suffering from? And listening, understanding, I think was a key point you were bringing in earlier, Eloise, in respect of the HCPs, but actually from a clinical trial design perspective, understanding what it is that clinical trial is looking for to address within the patient, because sometimes that can get overlooked and you get the whole excitement, as it were, of the science, of the drug development, of the grander picture. But it's actually the little individual at the end of the day who might benefit from that development that needs to be centre stage. And that was what was coming across in terms of patient centricity this year.
I think that's a really interesting point, Nicole, about the idea that we're now looking at the patient as a person. And I think historically there has been a real hesitation to see the patient as that human person, because that creates all kind of ethical questions. If you're looking at a bunch of sort of anonymized figures, it's much easier as a researcher to distance yourself from that, because it's this research can take a real heavy toll on people, on the clinicians that see people day to day. And I think for a long time there was a real effort to divide, to make sure that the patients were being seen as clinical studies so that you can separate the science from the person. I think what we're realizing now is that you can't, is that looking at the more personalized medicine and the more personalized care that we've seen, and as Nicole said, the value-based healthcare, which is a subject of the latest timeline in Deep Dive if you want to look at the history of that, casual plug, we're looking at what is actually going to create like tangible, valuable outcomes for both the patient and the HCP, and not just looking at what volume of drug are we selling, rather than how successful is this drug being for the end patient. That switching our concept of what do we see as a successful outcome? And I think that was a real interesting subject on the floor. And I think it's something that I noticed from the get-go, that you can see with certain companies, there is a real discrepancy between what they are presenting and what they are being seen as. And I think that it was a slightly controversial one that kicked off the conference was from Stefan Ulrich from Bayer, who got on stage. First thing he emphasized, we are spending millions and millions and millions in R&D. And then the first conversations that I was hearing when we got to the break was they just cut thousands of jobs for people who across the company. So whether or not there is that discrepancy between we are investing lots, is it going to the right places? That challenge, I think, is going to be something that the companies are really going to have to face in the coming years, particularly as we're seeing real financial restraints, whether that's from funding, from investors. That money is going to be limited over the next few years from everything that we're being shown by financial analysts. So figuring out where that money is going to be best spent to get the best results is going to be really crucial, not only for businesses to thrive, but for the patients as well. And I think having that end patient in mind is going to be so key moving forward.
In the few minutes we have left, is there either a trend we haven't talked about yet that you think, it would be incomplete if we didn't mention, or just a specific presentation, a specific quote that stuck with you, any anecdotes that we haven't talked about yet that you might want to share to give us the full picture of this event?
Not so much an anecdote as perhaps a sort of summarization of what's needed at the moment. And this was given by AstraZeneca's Stefan Wokstrom. And he noted a threefold sort of need list, if you will. The need for a forward-looking regulatory framework that encourages innovation. And that encouragement of innovation is really key, as has come across in our podcast today, to be honest with you. His second point was a need for a robust life sciences industry policy that, as we've been discussing, removes barriers to innovation and access. And thirdly, the need to rewire the management of diseases themselves, moving from reactive to proactive, that is to say, preventative measures.
I think I'll build on the rewire management, but not of disease, but of management. So old friend of the podcast, Ariel Samang, who is from Eversana in Touch, he was part of a panel where they were talking about bringing everybody with you. And I thought that was a really unique take on things. So looking at upskilling, but not just upskilling the people who are front-facing, the people who are going to be working directly with, say, if we're looking at AI search aids, but upskilling everybody in your staff. You want to bring everybody in your organization along with you to make sure that you are prepared for the next stage, so that your salesmen know exactly what is happening, what's coming next, so that your receptionists know what's happening within your company to the point where they can help to build and grow with you. Creating those real relationships, not just within your company, but alongside you as well. We're going to have the next generation of HCPs, of clinicians, of researchers are going to be coming in, and it's going to be our responsibility to ensure that they are skilled, that they know what's coming next, that they are excited to explore new innovations as they come. And I think that's going to be a real sticking point, is you have to be willing to invest in the infrastructure and the resources that you have around you in order to make those innovations last. Because it's really easy to come up with the next big thing, but if you don't have anything around that to support it, it will likely fail.
Absolutely. I
all comes back to the pulling
agree.
together.
Talent. And that goes across the board, as you say. from HCPs back to the beginning with research with the patients. It's the talent who can utilize also these advancing technologies. Talent.
Yeah, this
Not
theme
just the
of pulling
technologies.
together feels like it actually works on a lot of levels, right? You have different stakeholders working together. You have bringing in the patient, working together with the patient. You have internally making sure your whole team is working together, and then partnerships between pharma companies. So a lot of ideas packed into that metaphor.
Exactly. And I think it's important to note that it's not just the technical skills, it's the soft skills as well. Those abilities to communicate with people and to share your ideas in a way that they're going to be received and understood. That was another point that I noted around the discussions of AI, is that AI is great technically, but it needs to be supported with those soft skills, and that those soft skills should not be pushed to the side because they're seen as lesser in comparison to the technical skills, but they are absolutely crucial.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time today to discuss what you saw and heard. I'm glad it was a productive event. And those of you who are listening and who are interested in learning a little more about some of the things we've talked about, we have 3 days of Reuters Pharma live blogs. They're quite extensive. They go into detail in some of the particular speakers and topics that Nicole and Eloise have mentioned. And we'll link to those from the landing page on Pharma Forum here. And as Eloise mentioned, our latest deep dive on market access includes a lot of content from recent events that we've been at, including Reuters Pharma US and the AMR focused event Nicole was at a few weeks before that. So please do check all that out to learn more. That concludes this episode of the Pharma Forum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaforum.com/podcast. The Pharma Forum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for Pharma Forum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at Pharma Forum.